President Trump clearly thinks he can trust President Putin. None of the rest of us, including people like me who've dealt with Putin in the past, think that you can trust Putin. And indeed, if the war ended on those terms that you've just described, and that America seems prepared to potentially to accept, there would be more wars. You know, we've been through this in history before. That would be a very much emboldened Putin who would come back in the future for the rest of Ukraine, who would intimidate the Baltic states, who really would not rest until Europe was completely destabilized, and in his view, no threat to him in the future.
Our programme has been dominated by overnight news from Washington. The White House announced it was pausing military aid to Ukraine. Jerome Starkey, the Sun's defence editor, told us what impact this will have on the front line.
It has a moral blow more than an immediate sort of mechanical or physical manifestation on the front lines at the moment, because my understanding is that President Biden, former President Biden's, one of his final acts in office was to effectively ensure that Ukraine had enough arms, according to Western officials, that will get it through to the summit.
But what happens after the summit is still an interesting question. How's this all been received in Moscow? The Russian MP Evgeny Popov came on to tell us what Russia wants out of this.
We need neutral Ukraine, no NATO in Ukraine. You should get out your military infrastructure from our borders. It's simple.
Simple.
Well, I was going to say exactly the same thing.
Let's start with that big news overnight. The White House said that America is pausing military aid to Ukraine. Is this a way of forcing Ukraine to the negotiating table? Is that a positive way of treating the victim of an invasion? Is it just another way of making sure Russia gets what it wants out of all of this? William Hague, your reaction, your level of despair or optimism when you hear something like this?
Well, no optimism at all. I think it's important not to despair because clearly there'll be huge efforts by all allies of America, including the British government, to get that military aid to Ukraine resumed in the future. The Ukrainians will probably, they are prepared to sign the minerals agreement that was on the table last Friday before the disastrous meeting that took place at the White House. So they will be making efforts to show that they are interested in peace, just in a peace that is sustainable and fair, rather than a humiliating peace imposed on them. So we should not despair. But it does really underline the extent of this crisis. This is an emergency for Ukraine and for European security. And it's, there are the immediate implications, the immediate consequences that I just mentioned for governments to focus on. But this is a different world now. The head of the European Commission has just been saying this morning, there has to be a massive surge in defense spending across Europe, and painful though that is, that given the policies of the United States in so many ways now under President Trump, that is the unavoidable conclusion. So this is a big moment actually in European history, in British and European history.
And it's likely, William, that I keep coming back to this, and maybe I'm wrong too, that Putin's going to get away with this, isn't he, ultimately? We just heard Evgeny Popov on our show. What does Putin want? A neutral Ukraine, no membership of NATO, no military infrastructure on our borders. Well, America's willing to grant him all of those things in advance, before the negotiations even start. So we're going to have this invasion that's dominated our mind, cost billions and billions of dollars, led to hundreds of thousands of people being killed, war crimes committed. And it looks like the American position is for Russia to get to the table, they more or less get the status quo as they've achieved via the invasion.
Yes, well, that's pretty close now to the American position, just to stop the spending and end the war, really, without regard to the longer-term consequences. President Trump clearly thinks he can trust President Putin. None of the rest of us, including people like me who've dealt with Putin in the past, think that you can trust Putin. And indeed, if the war ended on those terms that you've just described, and that America seems prepared to potentially to accept, there would be more wars. We've been through this in history before. That would be a very much emboldened Putin who would come back in the future for the rest of Ukraine, who would intimidate the Baltic states, who really would not rest until Europe was completely destabilized, and in his view, no threat to him in the future. So, yeah, that would be setting the stage for a lot more war. So this is why, whatever happens now, we're into a new era of defense for Britain and Europe, because either we're going to be policing in some way what might be an unsatisfactory peace settlement in Ukraine. That will take a lot more defense spending, or we're going to have a far bigger disaster than that with Russia emboldened, and that involves far bigger defense spending. So that age is now arriving.
And Kezia, are we ready for that age? I think it's such an interesting point, and you can reflect on this domestically as well. We've talked about it a bit this week and last week. Is there a new version of Britain where we spend a fortune on defence, where we have more armaments factories, where we start talking about things like national service or at least resilience training for a population because we regard ourselves as part of a continent at war? That's a very different culture, a very different sort of spirit of the age than we've had for the last 30 years.
And it's one that's far more viable, likely, and in play than it was a week ago, even if it's still not that likely. It's quite extraordinary what's happened since we last spoke just 7 days ago, Stig, in terms of the immensity of these world events. And I'm just left feeling that there's no doubt in my mind now that President Trump has absolutely zero interest in Ukraine's sovereignty. He sees this as a business deal that is purely of economic interest to America. And he also seems to have very little interest in European security, which forces us to your position, which is we're simply going to have to spend billions and billions of pounds more securing our own defence provisions.
And that might involve taxes at some point. That might involve... That's the question, I suppose,
It's going to
Kezia.
have to.
Do you think it is? Do you think we can't keep cutting the cloth and say, oh, we'll change the financial rules here or we'll nip a bit here? If this is the world, that becomes we got to tax people up.
Nothing here can be addressed with tweaks, small tweaks to budget cuts, small tweaks to tax increases. This is going to require some quite phenomenal step changes, and it's going to have to be incredibly carefully crafted to ensure that the public flow with it. You've seen some of that already. So when you saw, Keir Starmer meeting with defence workers yesterday and pointing to the fact that with increased defence spending comes jobs, that's just, the very beginnings of what he's going to have to do here to make the case for vast increases in defence spending.
That's such an interesting point, Kezia. Do you think that Keir Starmer is ready to accept it? And more importantly, maybe Rachel Reeves, do you get the feeling, knowing them as you do and knowing Labour politicians as you do, that is now part of their thinking?
I think it probably is part of their thinking, but it's still at incredibly early stages, right? Because the kind of the need to front and centre this, for example, in all the thought processes associated with the spending review, has only become alive properly in the past week. So you've got to wonder how many documents are being rewritten across the entire civil service right now with this forefront of the mind. And that is just the actual logistics of how you find the money to spend what you need. The political argument that needs to be wrapped around this, particularly in the face of reform, yes, but also in those parts of the country where Labour has to sustain a centre-left and a left-wing vote, requires a different type of argument too. Otherwise, Labour is in danger of leaking a lot of support to Greens and to the Liberal Democrats and being overall weakened. Keir Starmer's always been, I think, pretty sure he's on for 10 years here as Prime Minister. That requires an awful lot of investment now in the political thinking, as well as the crafting of how you find billions and billions of pounds more investment for defence and European security.
Such a good point. William, one of the things that lots of our listeners have been messaging about today is trying to get behind the thinking of what's going on with Donald Trump right now. I mean, people expect changes of direction from him, but I think even, experts have said that they didn't see this pause in military aid to Ukraine coming as soon as it has. You've written a fascinating column, and one of the things that struck me most about it was how much of an echo chamber Trump and Vance are operating in, and how that is reinforcing what they're doing on the world stage. What is it that surprised you most about that atmosphere?
Well, there is. Yes, I was in Washington last week, not at these meetings that have hit their headlines.
You kept that quiet if you were.
Yeah, not far away though, and I had plenty of messages from people who were at those meetings. There is this incredible loyalty, almost sort of messianic loyalty to President Trump among the vast majority of Republicans. And of course, people are always, you might think, well, people are always loyal to a leader who's just won an election in any political party. That's generally true, but there's something much more extreme about this because of his personality, because he was lost the previous election, although he didn't admit that, because he became a convicted felon, because he was shot and narrowly survived, because he then won the election more convincingly than anybody had expected. Put all these things together, and you've really got an incredibly more than loyal base in the Republican Party that isn't going to challenge him. A couple of senators have said, out of 53 Republican senators have criticized things he's done in the last week, but that's all. So that does mean, yes, people are not in general going into the Oval Office and saying, you're wrong, Mr. President, which of course you do need in any system of government. So I think that's very unhealthy. But the other thing is they really are convinced that America has been wasting resources, and they might be right about some of that in public spending, in the way government is run, and they see Ukraine as part of that. Rather, we see Ukraine as a defensive struggle in Europe. They see Ukraine, that those particular American leaders, as more wasteful spending by the Biden administration. And so, they are very quick to cut it. And that, I think, is, when you understand those 2 points, you can see, I don't agree at all where they're coming from, but you can sort of see their line of thinking.
Kezia, that almost sounds like a bit of a cult. Do you think that's something that Western politicians ought to be concerned about?
Well, it fits very well with populism, and we know that Donald Trump is the ultimate populist, and feeding on people's fear and anger and emotions, and with that breeds a degree of loyalty that we're seeing now. And I think it's fair to say, we see this in America, that should you dare to offer an opinion that's contrary to Trump's, that's the end of you. And it feels like that will be how things are done for years yet, until we get much closer to the next US elections. He's going to be untouchable in that regard. But in a way, what we need is people to be keeping those lines of communication open. Just if you can edge him one way, just ever so slightly, that tiny bit of progress could matter a great deal.
And we're going to get on to how Starmer's handling that in a moment, because I think that's such a critical point that, to me, he seems to be both overpraised and over-criticised at the minute, Keir Starmer, and we'll get to that shortly. But just before we move off this, William, do you think Zelenskyy, in that circumstance, Zelenskyy can't have done anything in that meeting, or could he have done? Is there a world in which he shows up, puts a tie on, swallows his pride, humbles himself, lets him get away with talking all sorts of ahistorical nonsense in a braggadly fashion because it's an awful hour, but the rest of his life is to happen thereafter? Or in the circumstances you're talking about, there is no way of a leader of a country at war to talk to people like that. And if that had been Churchill in 1941 in the same situation, he'd have got a kick in the same way that Zelenskyy did.
Yeah, I think I don't blame Zelenskyy at all for sticking up for himself, and that's what he's been doing very well for 3 years for himself and his country. So, of course, he's in that mindset. But, yes, it would have been, given that atmosphere in Washington that I was just talking about, it would have been that the clever political thing would actually have been to nod at J.D. Vance and Trump and say how wise they are. And sign the minerals deal, to draw them in to Ukraine and to having a vested interest in a better peace settlement for Ukraine, and just sort of, swallow the embarrassment. That would have been, if I'd been further down the street in Washington advising Zelenskyy, that's what I would have told him to do, actually. So I think he made a mistake with a totally understandable and forgivable mistake, but it could have been played better on the Ukrainian side last week.